Sarah's wedding dress, stained with tears and dust, caught the desert wind as she stood at the crossroads of Willowbrook, Texas, clutching the letter that had shattered her world in a single cruel sentence. The year was 1887, and in a town where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children, Sarah Bennett had just become the most unwanted bride in 3 counties. What happened next would challenge everything the people of Willowbrook thought they knew about love, family, and the dark secrets that could destroy them all. The morning had started like any other wedding day. Sarah had awakened in the boarding house room she'd called home for the past month, watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Her wedding dress, carefully sewn by her own hands from ivory silk ordered from San Antonio, hung from the wooden beam like a promise of the new life awaiting her. Thomas Whitmore, her betrothed, owned the largest cattle ranch in the county, and their union was supposed to secure not just her future, but elevate her family's standing in the community. Her parents, wheat farmers from Kansas who had lost everything to drought and locusts, had already returned home, confident their daughter was finally settled. The ceremony at the small wooden church had proceeded without incident. Reverend Matthews spoke of duty and devotion while Sarah stood beside Thomas, her hand trembling slightly as he placed the simple gold band on her finger. The congregation, filled with ranch hands, shopkeepers, and neighboring farmers, smiled and nodded approvingly. Sarah had noticed Mrs. Henderson whispering to Mrs. Carleton during the vows, but weddings always inspired gossip among the town's women. She had no reason to suspect that the whispers were about her. The reception at the Whitmore Ranch had been modest but pleasant. The large wooden house, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings, represented everything Sarah had dreamed of since leaving Kansas. Thomas had been attentive, introducing her to his foreman and the other ranch employees, speaking of plans to expand the cattle operation and build a new barn come spring. Sarah had begun to relax, to believe that perhaps this arranged marriage might grow into something resembling affection, maybe even love. But as the sun set and the last guests departed, Thomas had asked to speak with her privately in his study. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, lined with books about cattle breeding and land management. Sarah had expected perhaps a conversation about household arrangements or their future plans. Instead, Thomas had handed her an envelope with her name written in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a letter from Dr. Harrison in Kansas City, the physician Sarah had consulted months earlier about persistent pain and irregular cycles. The letter, addressed to Thomas rather than to her, contained details of her medical condition that she had shared in confidence. The doctor's diagnosis was clear and devastating in the harsh language of 1887 medicine. Sarah was barren, incapable of bearing the children that were expected to secure the Whitmore family legacy. Thomas had read aloud from the letter as Sarah stood frozen in horror. The words echoed in the small room like gunshots, each medical term a nail in the coffin of her new marriage. When he finished reading, Thomas had folded the letter carefully and looked at her with eyes that had grown cold as winter stones. The marriage, he declared, had been entered into under false pretenses. He had married her expecting sons to inherit his ranch, not a woman who could never fulfill what he considered a wife's primary obligation. Sarah had tried to explain that she hadn't known, that the doctor's letter was supposed to be confidential, that surely they could find a way to make their marriage work despite this revelation. But Thomas was unmoved. He had already made his decision, probably before the ceremony had even begun. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, he admitted, but he had chosen to go through with the wedding to avoid scandal, planning all along to send her away once the festivities concluded. The humiliation cut deeper than any physical pain Sarah had ever experienced. To be cast aside on her wedding night, to have her most private medical information betrayed and used against her, felt like a violation beyond anything she could have imagined. Thomas had offered her a small amount of money and passage back to Kansas, but the gesture felt more like payment for services not rendered than any act of kindness. Her parents, he suggested, need never know the full truth behind her quick return. But Sarah's pride, perhaps the only thing she had left, wouldn't allow her to accept his charity. She had taken nothing from the house except her few personal belongings and the clothes she had worn to her own wedding. Walking out into the Texas night, she found herself on the main road leading away from the Whitmore Ranch, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The town of Willowbrook was too small for secrets, especially ones involving the county's most prominent rancher. By morning, everyone would know that Thomas Whitmore had sent his new bride away, and the speculation about why would follow Sarah like a shadow for the rest of her life. She couldn't return to her parents in Kansas, not without admitting the failure of the marriage they had arranged with such hope. She had a little money saved from her work as a seamstress, but not enough to start over in a distant city where no one knew her story. As she walked through the darkness, Sarah found herself approaching another ranch, smaller than the Whitmore spread but well-maintained from what she could see in the moonlight. A warm glow emanated from the windows of the main house, and she could hear the sound of children's laughter mixing with a man's deeper voice. The sign at the gate read Running Creek Ranch J. Sullivan, proprietor. Sarah had heard the name mentioned in town, usually in connection with his reputation as a fair employer and a dedicated father to his 3 daughters. Something about the warmth of that laughter drew Sarah toward the house like a moth to flame. She had no intention of knocking on the door or asking for help, but she found herself standing at the edge of the property, watching through the window as a tall man with dark hair helped a young girl with what appeared to be arithmetic homework while 2 other children played with wooden dolls nearby. The scene spoke of family contentment that Sarah had never experienced in her own childhood and had been denied the chance to create in her brief marriage. James Sullivan looked up from his daughter's schoolwork and noticed a figure standing in his yard, visible in the light spilling from his windows. At first, he thought it might be one of his ranch hands returning late from town, but the silhouette was clearly that of a woman in a dress far too fine for the rough country around Willowbrook. Concerned that someone might be lost or in trouble, he stepped onto his porch and called out a greeting. Sarah, startled by being discovered, tried to retreat into the shadows, but James had already recognized her as the woman who had married Thomas Whitmore just hours earlier. Her wedding dress, now dusty and wrinkled from her long walk, made her identity unmistakable. The fact that she was standing alone in his yard instead of celebrating her new marriage struck James as deeply troubling. When James approached and gently asked if she needed assistance, Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally crumbled. The events of the evening, the humiliation and betrayal, the uncertainty about her future, all came pouring out in a flood of tears that she couldn't control. James, a widower who had raised 3 daughters alone for the past 4 years, recognized the signs of a woman who had reached the end of her endurance. Without pressing for details about what had brought her to his property in the middle of the night, James invited Sarah into his house. His daughters, Mary aged 12, Rebecca aged 9, and little Emma aged 6, looked up curiously as their father brought the mysterious woman inside. James quickly explained that Mrs. Whitmore needed a place to rest for the night, and the girls, raised to show hospitality to anyone in need, immediately began fussing over their unexpected guest. Sarah found herself seated at the Sullivan family's kitchen table, wrapped in a warm quilt while James prepared coffee and his eldest daughter, Mary, offered to help her out of the elaborate wedding dress and into something more practical. The kindness of strangers felt almost overwhelming after the cruelty she had experienced at her husband's hands. When James finally asked what had happened, Sarah found herself telling him everything: the medical condition, the betrayed confidence, Thomas's rejection, and her current predicament. James listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never making Sarah feel like she needed to defend her actions or choices. As a man who had lost his own wife to complications in childbirth, he understood the cruel irony of Sarah's situation, condemned for a condition that might have actually protected her from the dangers that had claimed his beloved Elizabeth. When Sarah finished her story, James was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications of what she had told him. The offer that James made was as unexpected as it was generous. His daughters needed a woman's influence in their lives, and he needed help managing the household duties that had become increasingly difficult to handle while running a ranch. If Sarah was willing to stay, he would provide room and board in exchange for helping with the children and the domestic responsibilities that came with managing a working ranch. It wouldn't be a marriage, he was careful to clarify, but a business arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. Sarah stared at James in amazement, Here was a man offering her exactly what Thomas had denied her: a place in a family, a chance to help raise children, a home where her inability to bear children of her own wouldn't be held against her. The offer seemed too good to be true, and Sarah found herself wondering what James Sullivan's real motives might be. In her experience, men rarely offered help without expecting something in return, and she had learned to be suspicious of apparent kindness. But the Sullivan household felt different from anything Sarah had experienced before. The children clearly adored their father, and their easy affection toward him suggested that he was genuinely the caring parent he appeared to be. Mary, despite being only 12, had taken on many adult responsibilities in managing her younger sisters, but she did so with grace rather than resentment. Rebecca was bright and curious, full of questions about Sarah's dress and the wedding she had supposedly attended. Little Emma, barely out of toddlerhood, had already decided that Sarah was the most beautiful lady she had ever seen. As the night wore on, Sarah began to realize that James's offer might be her salvation. She had skills that would be valuable in managing his household, from her experience as a seamstress to her basic education that could help with the children's schooling. In return, she would have a roof over her head, meaningful work, and the chance to be part of a family that actually wanted her presence. The arrangement would also provide her with a respectable reason for not returning to the Whitmore Ranch or fleeing back to Kansas in shame. But accepting James's offer would mean staying in Willowbrook, where everyone would soon know about her failed marriage. She would have to face the gossip and speculation that would inevitably follow, the whispered conversations about why Thomas Whitmore had sent his bride away on their wedding night. Sarah wasn't sure she had the strength to endure the scrutiny that would come with remaining in the community where her humiliation had occurred. James seemed to understand her hesitation without her having to voice it. He assured her that his ranch was far enough from town that she wouldn't have to deal with curious neighbors on a daily basis, and that he had little patience for gossip or the people who spread it. His primary concern was for his daughter's well-being and the efficient running of his property. If Sarah could help with both of those needs, the opinions of others were irrelevant. The sincerity in James's voice convinced Sarah to accept his offer, at least temporarily. She agreed to stay for a month, giving both of them time to see if the arrangement would work for everyone involved. If either party was unsatisfied, she would move on with no hard feelings and a positive reference that might help her find employment elsewhere. It seemed like a reasonable compromise that protected everyone's interests while giving Sarah the breathing room she desperately needed. The first few days at the Running Creek Ranch passed quietly as Sarah adjusted to her new role in the Sullivan household. She discovered that Mary had been trying valiantly to manage the cooking, cleaning, and care of her younger sisters, but the responsibility was clearly too much for a 12-year-old child. Sarah immediately began taking over the domestic duties, allowing Mary to return to being a child rather than a substitute mother. Rebecca and Emma welcomed Sarah's presence enthusiastically, thrilled to have a woman in the house who could help with their hair, mend their clothes properly, and answer the questions that their father sometimes found difficult to address. Sarah found herself enjoying the girls' company more than she had expected, their innocent chatter and boundless energy providing a welcome distraction from her own troubles. James proved to be exactly what he had seemed, a devoted father who worked hard to provide for his family while maintaining a warm and loving home environment. He treated Sarah with respectful courtesy, never overstepping the boundaries they had established, while making it clear that he valued her contributions to the household. The arrangement felt natural and comfortable in a way that Sarah's brief marriage never had. But the peaceful routine was disrupted when Thomas Whitmore appeared at the ranch a week after Sarah's arrival. He had come, he claimed, to discuss the dissolution of their marriage and to offer Sarah a final settlement that would allow her to leave Texas with her dignity intact. The conversation that followed revealed depths of manipulation and cruelty that Sarah hadn't fully understood on her wedding night. Thomas had known about Sarah's medical condition before their engagement had been finalized. The letter from Dr. Harrison had been sent to him weeks earlier, after he had made inquiries about Sarah's health through mutual acquaintances in Kansas. Rather than calling off the engagement honorably, Thomas had proceeded with his plans, intending all along to use the wedding as a cover for acquiring Sarah's small dowry, while giving himself grounds to annul the marriage immediately afterward. The revelation that her marriage had been nothing more than an elaborate fraud designed to steal her modest inheritance left Sarah reeling. Thomas had never intended to honor their vows or build a life with her. She had been nothing more than a convenient victim for his financial scheming, her medical condition providing the perfect excuse to discard her once he had what he wanted. The cruelty of the deception was breathtaking in its calculated precision. James, who had been present for Thomas's visit, was visibly angry at the other man's behavior. The two ranchers had known each other for years, and James had always considered Thomas to be ambitious but basically honorable. Learning about the elaborate fraud that had been perpetrated against Sarah changed his opinion dramatically, and he made it clear that Thomas was no longer welcome on his property. Sarah's first impulse was to confront Thomas about his theft of her dowry and demand its return, but James counseled patience. Thomas was one of the most powerful men in the county, with connections that could make life difficult for anyone who challenged him publicly. A direct confrontation might result in Sarah being painted as a vindictive woman trying to destroy an innocent man's reputation, especially since she had no proof of his deception beyond his own admission. Instead, James suggested that Sarah consider her options carefully. If she truly wanted to fight Thomas's theft, she would need evidence and allies, both of which might be difficult to obtain given his status in the community. Alternatively, she could choose to move forward with her life, treating the lost dowry as the price of escaping a marriage that would have made her miserable even if Thomas had honored his commitments. The decision wasn't easy for Sarah. The money Thomas had stolen represented years of careful saving and her only financial security in an uncertain world. But pursuing legal action would mean exposing herself to public scrutiny and likely reliving her humiliation in front of the entire community. More importantly, it would mean leaving the Sullivan Ranch and the sense of belonging she had begun to develop there. As Sarah wrestled with her decision, she began to notice subtle changes in James's behavior toward her. Their conversations had become longer and more personal, extending beyond practical household matters to include discussions of books, philosophy, and their hopes for the future. Sarah caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't aware, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested his feelings might be evolving beyond simple appreciation for her domestic skills. The children had also begun treating Sarah less like a hired helper and more like a permanent member of their family. Emma had started calling her Miss Sarah, with the same affection she might use for a beloved aunt. Rebecca sought her advice on everything from schoolwork to friendships with other children in the area. Even Mary, initially protective of her role as the household's female authority figure, had begun to relax and enjoy having another adult woman to confide in about the challenges of growing up. The sense of family that was developing at the Running Creek Ranch stood in sharp contrast to the cold calculation that had characterized Sarah's brief marriage to Thomas. Here, she was valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. The children loved her not because she might give them siblings, but because she listened to their concerns, helped with their problems, and made their daily lives warmer and more comfortable. One evening, as Sarah was helping Emma prepare for bed, the little girl asked innocently whether Sarah would be staying forever or if she would have to leave like their mother had. The question, asked without any understanding of the complex adult emotions involved, forced Sarah to confront the reality of her situation. She had begun to think of the Sullivan Ranch's home, but her arrangement with James was temporary, designed to help her get back on her feet rather than provide a permanent solution to her problems. Sarah's conversation with Emma prompted a deeper discussion with James about their future arrangements. The month they had originally agreed upon was nearly over, and both of them had to acknowledge that the situation was working well for everyone involved. The children were happier and better cared for than they had been since their mother's death, and Sarah had found a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never experienced before. But the temporary nature of their arrangement was becoming a source of anxiety for everyone in the household. The children had grown attached to Sarah and were beginning to worry about her leaving. James found himself reluctant to consider what life would be like without her steady presence and capable management of domestic affairs. Sarah herself was torn between the security of staying and the fear that she was becoming too comfortable in a situation that might not be permanent. The conversation that finally clarified their relationship occurred on a warm evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant colors. James had been unusually quiet during dinner, and Sarah had sensed that something was troubling him. When she asked if there was a problem with her work or her interaction with the children, James surprised her by admitting that his feelings had evolved beyond the business arrangement they had originally discussed. James's confession that he had come to care for Sarah as more than just a household manager was both thrilling and terrifying. She had begun to develop feelings for him as well, but the circumstances of her arrival and her recent humiliation had made her wary of trusting her own emotions. The idea that someone could love her despite her inability to bear children seemed almost too good to believe, especially after Thomas's cruel rejection. The conversation that followed was careful and tentative, both of them aware that they were discussing a fundamental change in their relationship that would affect not just themselves, but the 3 children who had come to depend on both of them. James was clear that his primary responsibility was to his daughters, and any decision about their future would have to take their needs into account. Sarah assured him that she felt the same way, that her love for the children was genuine and not dependent on her relationship with their father. But even as they explored the possibility of a future together, Sarah couldn't shake the shadow cast by her failed marriage and the secrets that had destroyed it. She worried that James, despite his apparent acceptance of her medical condition, might eventually come to resent her inability to give him sons to help with the ranch work. She also feared that the gossip surrounding her broken marriage might eventually reach his daughters and cause them embarrassment or social difficulties. James listened to Sarah's concerns with the same patience he had shown on the night she first arrived at his ranch. He reminded her that he had already been through the experience of losing a wife to childbirth complications, and that his perspective on family had been shaped by that tragedy. His daughters were his priority, and any woman who could love and care for them was more valuable to him than the possibility of additional children who might never survive to adulthood. The practical considerations of their potential union were also discussed with the same straightforward honesty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. James made it clear that he could provide financial security and social respectability, while Sarah brought domestic skills, education, and genuine affection for his children. It would be a partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than the romantic passions celebrated in popular novels. But both of them had learned that practical compatibility might be more valuable than fleeting emotions. Their courtship, if it could be called that, proceeded slowly and carefully over the following weeks. James began including Sarah in decisions about ranch management and the children's education, treating her as a partner rather than an employee. Sarah gradually allowed herself to believe that she might have found a place where she could build a meaningful life, regardless of the circumstances that had brought her there. The children's enthusiasm for the developing relationship between their father and Sarah provided the final confirmation that the arrangement could work for everyone involved. Mary, old enough to understand the adult complexities involved, gave her approval after a serious conversation with Sarah about her intentions and commitment to the family. Rebecca and Emma simply assumed that Sarah would stay forever, treating the possibility of her leaving as too absurd to consider seriously. The proposal, when it finally came, was as practical and straightforward as everything else about James Sullivan. He asked Sarah to marry him not in a moment of romantic passion, but during a quiet discussion about planning for the children's future education. The question was presented as a logical next step rather than a declaration of undying love, but Sarah found the honesty refreshing after the deception that had characterized her previous engagement. Sarah's acceptance came with conditions that protected both of them from potential future disappointments. She wanted a marriage based on partnership and mutual respect rather than romantic illusion, with clearly understood roles and responsibilities that would benefit the entire family. James agreed readily, admitting that his own priorities had evolved since Elizabeth's death to focus on stability and contentment rather than passionate romance. Their wedding, held at the small church in Willowbrook 6 months after Sarah's disastrous first ceremony, was a deliberate contrast to her previous experience. The guest list was small, limited to close friends and neighbors who had come to know and respect Sarah during her time at the Running Creek Ranch. The ceremony itself was brief and focused on the practical commitments they were making to each other and to the children who would benefit from their union. The town's gossips had plenty to say about James Sullivan marrying Thomas Whitmore's cast-off bride, but their opinions carried less weight than they had expected. Sarah had proven herself to be a valuable member of the community through her work with the children and her contributions to local charitable efforts. James's reputation as an honorable man provided additional protection from the worst of the speculation and rumors. Thomas Whitmore's reaction to the news of Sarah's remarriage was telling in its vindictive anger. He had expected her to disappear from the county in shame, not to find happiness and respectability with another rancher. His attempts to spread damaging rumors about Sarah's character and medical condition were met with skepticism from people who had observed her behavior firsthand and found her to be exactly what she appeared: a decent woman who had been treated badly by her first husband. The revelation of Thomas's true character came gradually as other people began sharing their own experiences with his business practices and personal behavior. Sarah learned that she had not been his only victim, that other people had been deceived and manipulated by his schemes over the years. The knowledge that she was not uniquely gullible or unfortunate was both comforting and disturbing. Sarah's new marriage proved to be everything her first had not been, built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. James treated her as an equal partner in managing their household and raising his daughters, never making her feel like a substitute for his deceased wife or a consolation prize for his loneliness. The children thrived under the stability and love that characterized their family life. The mystery of how Thomas had obtained Dr. Harrison's confidential letter was finally solved when Sarah received an unexpected visit from her former physician during a trip to Kansas City. Dr. Harrison explained that Thomas had presented himself as Sarah's concerned fiancé, claiming that he needed to understand her medical condition in order to provide proper care for her after their marriage. The doctor, believing he was acting in Sarah's best interests, had shared information that should have remained confidential. The revelation that Thomas had deliberately sought out her private medical information in order to use it against her confirmed Sarah's growing understanding of his manipulative nature. She realized how lucky she had been to escape a marriage that would have been built on deception and exploitation from its very beginning. The pain of her wedding night humiliation began to fade as she understood that Thomas's rejection had actually saved her from years of unhappiness. Sarah's story became a source of inspiration for other women in similar situations, proof that a woman's worth was not determined solely by her ability to bear children. Her success in building a loving family with James and his daughters demonstrated that there were many ways to create meaningful relationships and contribute to a community. The Running Creek Ranch became known as a place where people in need could find help and understanding, regardless of their circumstances. Years later, as Sarah watched Mary graduate from the local school and prepare to become a teacher herself, she reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. The night she had stood crying in James Sullivan's yard, convinced that her future held nothing but loneliness and shame, she could never have imagined the happiness and fulfillment that awaited her. Her inability to bear children, once seen as a tragic flaw, had become irrelevant in the face of the love she had found with her chosen family. The letters that occasionally arrived from Thomas Whitmore, usually containing vague threats or demands related to their annulled marriage, served as reminders of the life she had escaped rather than sources of anxiety. Sarah would read them calmly and then file them away, secure in the knowledge that Thomas no longer had any power over her happiness. She had found something infinitely more valuable than the biological family she could never have, a chosen family that valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide.